Jovanovski, and I'm honored to be the chair of today's panel. So welcome to the Skopje Forums on the future of liberal democracy, Europe and the Balkans. Third panel, we are going to talk today on the conditions of the market liberalism and political liberalism as well. I am very pleased to have four distinguished speakers today sitting next to me. Let me give you a brief overview of their really impressive biographies. Professor Renata Selecel sitting next to me is a philosopher and sociologist and a representative of the very famous Slovenian School of Psychoanalysis. She works at the Institute of Criminology at the Faculty of Law in Ljubljana, and she's also a visiting professor at the Cardozo School of Law in New York and School of Law at Birkbeck College in London. She has published widely on various topics, and she also gives lectures at many universities abroad. So welcome to Skopje. We are very glad to have you here, Professor Selecel. Well, next to her is Srečko Horvat, the hope for the post-Yugoslav New Left, as some people want to say it.
If I'm the hope, then there is no hope.
So you're being too modest. He is one of the founders of Zagreb's Subversive Festival. That was the focal point that collected people from all over the region and globally, discussing ideas of utmost importance and related to capitalism, also to liberalism, and so on and so forth. He has also published widely. His latest book is What Europe Does Want, and it's published together with Slavoj Žižek. Then I have Slaviša Tasić. He is an economist. He's the only economist in this panel. We are all theorists and philosophers. So he has finished economics at the Belgrade University, and also taught in Ukraine, Russia, and Lithuania, and he's currently located at the University of Mary in North Dakota, USA, where he's an associate professor of economics. And then I also have Professor Ognjen Minchev, who is a political scientist and publicly engaged intellectual in Sofia, in Bulgaria. Let me just briefly find his bio here. He's the Dean of the Department of the Political Science at the University of Sofia, 1999-2008, and policy analyst. He's chairing the board of Transparency International Bulgaria, and his publications are mostly focused on the issue of post-communist transition, institutional reform, and modernization, energy security, transatlantic relations, Russian and post-Soviet studies. So this is, as our guests today are concerned, our topic is, as I mentioned, the future of market economy and liberalism. Let me make a brief introduction to this, relating it to previous discussions we had on panels yesterday. I am noticing that as far as the forum is unfolding, we're becoming more and more critical in terms of trying to understand the issues we have today in a more genealogical, let's say, or sociological, even philosophical sense. Initially, we had very brief introduction on the role of EU, current role of the EU and its relations with the Balkans. Then we also mentioned some aspects of the EU current economic crisis in the EU, and we, in the end, Bankovska, Jovic, and Spiros Sophos also raised some more critical and also theoretical issues as how to understand EU, how to denaturalize the concept of European integration and apply some more critical thinking. We do need critical thinking, otherwise we are ending up in totalitarianism. So without a critic, we cannot understand what's important to us. So the idea for the panel today is to firstly analyze the current global dynamics of capitalism. You know, we cannot possibly understand the European Union in its current crisis without reflecting briefly, without reflecting in a wider and a deeper manner, and without understanding the very notion, the very ideology of liberalism as such. So, before inviting Professor Salecl and Srećko to give us to share their ideas with us on the liberal notion of end of history and the future, I would kindly ask Slaviša Tasić, as I mentioned, he's the economist here, to inform us on the current dynamic of global capitalism. We had the global economic crisis in 2008, although if we take a Marxist perspective, capitalism as such is a crisis, you know, it unfolds in through crisis. So I would like to ask Slaviša to share some thoughts with us on this very important issue to us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Igor. Well, I prepared my notes to talk about capitalism in general, but then as we shared with Igor, the idea was to start with 2008, to start with this current or previous financial and then economic crisis. So we are shifting gears a little bit here. Generally, when we talk about the crisis of capitalism, I have to notice that, in fact, to quote my old professor and friend Steve Pavich, who says that capitalism is the longest dying patient. It's been dying in the last 300 years. You know, Marx declared it's over, Lenin did, the Great Depression, 1929, capitalism was over, and it's still dying. You know, every time there's a little bit of a crisis, we are developing theories now. All right, what's next? This is the end. This is terrible, and all that. On the contrary, you know, we can quote Marx himself, where he says, it's hardly recognizable, that's Marx's quote, but he says capitalism or the bourgeois society created more wealth than all other systems combined ever in history. So it's an amazing achievement. That's what happened, and we have to deal with these facts. However, let me turn to this current 2008 crisis, financial crisis that stirred up and created a lot of questions about capitalism in general. I have a problem with that, with the general view of that crisis. Wherever I go or whenever I look at an op-ed, a column, just opinions out there, I see people generally. I guess that the predominant opinion is the crisis was caused somehow by free markets, and it was the markets somehow outdid themselves, they over-speculated, and then that's what created the crisis. So unbridled free markets in the financial sector are somehow guilty for the financial crisis, and I think that's the dominant view. About that view, I'm really confused. I would consider it as there was this Austrian physicist who his student brought him a paper, and Wolfgang Pauli was a physicist, and he said, he looked at the paper and said, look, this is not even wrong. It is not even wrong. So you are claiming things that don't even exist. So not even wrong is a step further from being wrong. And so I think this view that the free markets created a crisis is not even wrong, in the sense that in the first place there were not free markets, especially in the financial area. Finance is the single most regulated area in the entire economy. Maybe health can compete there, which is also a screwed up area, coincidentally. But finance is the most regulated area. Look at the number of pages. Look at the number of agencies regulating finance, especially in the United States, which generally is considered more free market than Europe. But financial area is actually more regulated. It was before the crisis, and it is now. A number of agencies the increasing number of pages. If you just look at that, I know it's a primitive measure regulation, but there's not really a perfect way to measure regulation. But the number of pages, thousands of pages, increasing up to 2008 of regulation. Ask any banker, they have entire departments that just do compliance with regulations. So I don't know how we can describe that system as unregulated or a free market system. The second or the third, I mentioned healthcare out of context, but third most regulated area is probably housing, in the United States especially. So we had the government having affordable housing policies since at least the 70s. It was before that too, but these policies have been growing. In the end, just before the crisis, the government was behind a half of all mortgage loans. Two government agencies that were in private ownership, but they were created by the US Congress, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That's the government stimulation of housing. So they bought up these mortgage-backed securities. I don't want to get too technical here, but these are essential issues in mortgage-backed securities. So the government agencies bought up these mortgage-backed securities that banks who gave out mortgages to people could sell always to these government-backed agencies. And we had, so they held half of all mortgages. How is that a free market system? How is that a failure of free market? I just think that is not even wrong. The other, or let me go a step back actually to this dominant or general diagnosis of free markets as a cause of the crisis, and then when I try to scratch deeper in the mechanism, okay, how does it happen? Maybe we'll try to figure that out later. Maybe somebody will help me here, but I couldn't learn how exactly did free markets, if they did it, how did they create crisis exactly? And then I hear things like, all right, it's greed. It's a lot of greedy people, a lot of these greedy capitalists that okay, I guess we can agree greed is not good. We are not the guy from the Wall Street movie. Economists always thought about it. From Adam Smith, nobody ever said that greed is good. We don't make any moral assumption about that. But how does greed create crisis, really? Was greed out there in the last 300 years when capitalism achieved these spectacular successes? Did greed just appear in September 2008? I can't figure out how does greed really, what is the causal mechanism? The second thing I couldn't figure out, now let's assume bankers were especially greedy. Does greed make people do risky stuff that they did? I feel in my conception of greed that a greedy person is a Scrooge. They hide all the money under the pillow. They don't go to a casino, right? So it's people that like risking that go to casinos. I think there's something else going on in this crisis. I think it's a misperception of risk. What we know about the crisis is that bankers, half of it was the state-owned mortgages, but the other half, bankers made some risky bets, and these risks turned out to be higher than they thought. So it was a misperception of risk. But why did they take these risks? Then I hear it's because they're greedy. I still don't see the causal mechanism. If you're greedy, do you go to a casino? In my view, they made risky bets because there was a big misperception of risk. They thought, all the evidence that I see shows that they thought that these mortgage-backed securities, these mortgages were a very safe investment. We are talking about an investment with relatively low yields, but having AAA, this highest type of rating, considered very safe, considered a conservative investment, and they massively invested into that. To me, the cause of the crisis is when we talk about the private part of it, the private sector part of it, is the misperception of risk. Why did that happen, though? How come that markets misperceived or misunderstood risk so badly? How did that happen? And then we can go step by step. I think that's a really long story, and we have to limit ourselves. But again, let's just take a step in that direction and see how did they decide on these risks? Banks. So when a bank decides whether do I give a loan to you or do I buy a mortgage-backed security, what makes them decide on it? Do they just measure interest rates or what's going on? When we scratch there, we see that, well, risk and regulation of risk, risk is also regulated. So we had a system since the 1980s, but that increased in the early 2000s, the system of international regulation, the Basel banking regulation, that is voluntary for states, but all major economies and minor economies adopted it, including the United States. So this Basel regulation very precisely describes what bears what kind of risk. And banks are incentivized to buy securities that were less risky, according to the Basel regulation then adopted by the Federal Reserve and the US regulatory authorities. The regulation literally said that business loans, regular loans to individuals, to businesses are very risky. Do not do that. Financially, you're incentivized to not do that. The regulation literally said, you know what is less risky? Mortgage-backed securities. Buy those. They made them financially better for banks, mortgage-backed securities. Behind that was, I think partly was still this affordable housing idea. The bigger part was that the regulators themselves, having good intentions, they themselves made a mistake. And that's very dangerous. When a business makes a mistake, the business goes down. When the regulator makes a mistake, and we have a system where behavior of banks is uniform because of regulation, all banks are the same because they're instructed so. When the regulator makes a mistake, the whole system goes down. And I think that's what happened. The regulators instructed banks to buy mortgage-backed securities. And they all did it. They just drank the Kool-Aid, the US banks, the European banks. Let's spread the story a little bit to Europe. It's a very similar situation. The Eurozone crisis that happened right after that has a very similar cause. It's not all the same. But the same Basel regulation also said, you know what is a very safe investment? Even safer than mortgage-backed securities. Government bonds. All Eurozone bonds. All Eurozone bonds, including Greek bonds, including Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, all the countries that ended up in a financial crisis. Banks massively, why did German and the French banks buy Greek bonds? They were incentivized. Regulation massively made them massively buy those things, telling them if you buy this, you have to. The mechanism there is you can hold less capital, which in practice means it's financially more convenient for you. It's cheaper for you to buy Greek bonds than to say give loans to businesses. And I see that as a failure of regulation. That is the only causal mechanism that I can see that created the crisis. I think, you know, the story goes further. I think the wider problem of the system today, which is, you know, regulated capitalism, social democracy with the regulated capitalism, is this imposition of knowledge from top down. So we have regulators who decide that something is good, and they impose this kind of behavior to the entire financial system. When the regulator makes a mistake, everything goes down. That's what I see as the cause of the crisis. Again, the broader story would be how do we deal with that? Right now, the answer is not to change the system, but to correct regulatory mistakes. So right now, the reaction to the crisis in the past few years in Europe and the United States was to create more regulation, but now it's better. And I don't see that as a change in the system. You know, that there's this whole, the new in US Dodd-Frank Act, 3,000 pages that then gives rise to another tens of thousands of pages, because each legal stipulation, each paragraph has, you know, provides for another agency, and then you have to write rules for that. So just massive increase of regulation, but the system is the same. You still have the regulator that instructs banks. The Basel regulation, this international regulation, had an updated version, but again, the system is the same. They changed risks. So they played around with that. They didn't change the system. They are kind of doubling down, they are doing more of the same. And I feel that that is the real problem, that we trust too much. I don't doubt intention, but I doubt the knowledge. I think we all human error, we all make mistakes. Regulatory mistakes are very, very expensive, and we are still betting on wise regulators. And I think that's not a very good idea, and that may create some future crisis. I don't know if this was a good introduction, and we can start from here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Slavish. Absolutely, I think it was a very interesting introduction, and I think you raised some very important issues, like demythologizing this idea that they're totally free markets and ruthless markets who are, destroying everything in front of themselves, which is the most heard assumption. But although there are some critical voices saying that there is no free market economy, and even this free market economy was heavily regulated, there was a very strong state intervention in it as such. So there is no anti-statist, non-regulated neoliberalism. But on the other hand, we had this 2008 bubble in the market of equities and the market of derivatives, which was, I guess, I'm not an economist, unregulated or not enough regulated, and it caused the overall crisis. So maybe we can mention this after we hear the thoughts of the other speakers. So thank you once again. So I'm turning to Horvat now. Perhaps as Slaviša mentioned, we do not need to change the system. We need more regulations. So what would you say about it? How would you understand this through the analysis of the liberal end of history concept, and taking into account the fact that the capitalism is the only possible, materialist production of wealth that we can afford as human beings?
Thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me here. I'm really glad to be here. Since these days you cannot come to a conference and not mention Thomas Piketty, it reminded me of conferences 5 or 10 years ago, or even earlier, although I don't remember the earlier ones from the beginning of the 90s, but I can suppose you couldn't come to a conference and not mention Francis Fukuyama, of course. So I think in the next 10 years we will always keep mentioning Piketty as we did Fukuyama, but I still think it's not over with Fukuyama, and I will start precisely by mentioning Francis Fukuyama, since we are now not only celebrating or commemorating the 100th anniversary of the First World War, but also 25 years since the collapse of communism and Berlin Wall, and at the same time the publication of this famous Francis Fukuyama's paper about the end of history. So I would try to start exactly by this thesis, and then also reflect on some theses which were mentioned here, and come to the Balkans and Yugoslavia as well. It may sound difficult, but I hope I will succeed it in just 10 minutes. In 2011, just when Fukuyama published his book, The Origins of Political Order, the first volume, I had the opportunity to speak with him in Paris, and it was a very interesting conversation, where I think for the first time, probably not for the first time, but for the first time I noticed he made a slight revision of his thesis about the end of history. He did it already in his book, Our Post-Human Future, where he claimed we didn't really arrive to the level of the end of the history, because biogenetics can still change, or can now change, human nature, so this is still not the end. Of course, when we speak about the end of history, then we don't speak about, as we all know, about the end of history as such, but it's an Hegelian idea that history has reached its end because there is no struggle between different ideas anymore. between different ideologies. Of course, in Fukuyama's perspective, this is the end of communism, and liberal democracy as such will prevail. So already in this book, Our Post-Human Future, he claimed that this is really not the case. And during our conversation, he mentioned two other reasons which I think still are valid today. The first was already mentioned in his book, The Origins of Political Order, where he claimed that liberal democracies, especially Western liberal democracies, face something what he called, I'm not sure if this is the exact term, decay of the institutions of democracy. Which means, of course, corruption, inefficiency of the institutions of liberal democracy, and so on. And when I asked him, but do you think terrorism still poses a threat to liberal Western democracy? Then he said, I never claimed terrorism may pose a threat, but the biggest threat to liberal democracy today is China. And this is really interesting, because I think it goes in a different direction than this you just mentioned, because what we have today, and Fukuyama was right in this, I must say he was right, is a tendency of capitalism to go into the direction of a new totalitarianism without democracy. And this is the prevailing trend of capitalism today. What was interesting, actually, after I published this interview in Croatia, the Chinese ambassador in Croatia gave a huge interview claiming Fukuyama is a banana man. What was very interesting, because he said, we in China, we are tempted to call all those people who come from the West banana people. From outside they are yellow, from inside they are white. I'm tempted to say, actually, what we have in Europe today is a completely obverse scenario. From outside it's white, from outside it looks like democracy, but from inside it's becoming more and more yellow. And here maybe I would agree to some degree that we have more regulation, but I would disagree on the level that this regulation is not helping the financial systems. I would claim the opposite, that exactly this regulation is helping the free market. So what we have today is neither a strong state, neither a strong free market, but we have some sort of collaboration between the two. And I would go even a step further, and I would claim that maybe, and I'm claiming this as a leftist, that maybe in the Balkans we should try with the free market. In the sense, let's see if the biggest monopolist from Croatia, who is now buying the biggest, one of the biggest corporations in Slovenia, who is already present in Serbia, let's see if he would survive without the state. He wouldn't even reach to this degree of wealth if there wasn't a state who was, when he was avoiding paying taxes and so on, and who led him to become the biggest monopolist. Anyway, I will return to this later. What I see with Fukuyama's thesis about the end of history is that we really face 25 years later the end of history. I would agree not only that China is one reason why liberal democracy as such is not the only game in town. I would claim not only that we have India, but also countries like Singapore, South Korea, where we have a similar system, like China. On the other hand, we have, of course, Brazil and Latin America, which are still, in a way, threatening this model of liberal democracy with some leftist ideas. For example, participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre, workers' councils in Venezuela, and so on. The second, I would say, Fukuyama didn't predict, maybe he did, in this sense of the decay of the institutions, the rise of the new conservative forces or the right. What we see in Europe exactly after the elections is that the new right-wing parties are, in a way, maybe not questioning the model of free market, neoliberalism or liberalism, however we might call it, but they are questioning the concept of democracy. And third, the European elections showed also something different, and this is the rise of the left. And of course this may sound like a provocative thesis when we have in mind the numbers of more than 20% in whole Europe when we count it together of the rise of right-wing parties. But what is remarkable is not only Syriza anymore in Greece, who got 27% and now are the most powerful opposition party, not only opposition anymore in Greece, but new parties all around Europe, new left parties. So for example, you have the case of the Spanish